Please take a seat and we're going to get started now. It's wonderful to see you all here at the Blavatnik School of Government here in Oxford. And we have a equally large crowd, I believe, online joining us from around the world. It's a wonderful chance to be able to talk with a panel and with each other about the elections last week in South Africa and the negotiations ongoing as we meet here about the formation of a new government. I'm Chris Stone, Professor of Practice of Public Integrity here at the Blavatnik School of Government. And I am delighted to be joined online by Lindiwe Mazibuko, the founding director of Futurelect, by Sherylle Dass, the regional director of the Legal Resources Center for Cape Town in South Africa, and here in the room with us, Jonny Steinberg, a South African author and writer generally. And we want to have a conversation over this next hour about the elections in South Africa, what they mean for South Africa, what they mean in a wider context of the world. We'll have a conversation among the panel, probably for the first 20 minutes or so of the evening. And then I hope we'll open it up and get a lot of you involved with your questions, comments, your thoughts about the discussion. For those of you online, please use the Q&A function on your screens to join in the conversation. And we hope to get many of you involved in the discussion as we go. But let me start. I'm sure all of you joining know the basics, but at least just before I came down to the room, the situation seemed to be this. The election results, the election on the 29th of May, the results were announced this past Sunday on June 2nd, with the ANC winning 159 seats in the 400-member National Assembly with about 40% of the vote. A huge drop of 71 seats from their total seats in the prior parliament. The Democratic Alliance, the DA, took the second largest share of the vote with 8, and they received 87 seats. And the MK, the brand new party registered just in September, led, at least it appears to be led by Jacob Zuma, with 58 seats in the parliament. The EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters, came in fourth. They have 39 seats, and with a whole series of smaller parties taking the remaining seats. We now have about 12 days left in the period in which a government needs to be formed, and the rules are that the new parliament must sit within 14 days of the announcement of the results. That gets us to the 16th of June, when the new parliament will be seated, officers elected, and a president elected. There was more than just the results that we may touch on today. The turnout itself has been subject to a lot of discussion. 16.3 million people voted. That's 59% of the 28 million registered voters, but only less than 40% of the eligible voting population of South Africa. And the run-up to the election, as in some other countries, there was a lot of concern about political violence in South Africa. Since September, somewhere between 20 and 40 local councillors, politicians have been killed in the country, and worry about the extent of violence, political violence in the country, has been an underlying theme and concern through a lot of this period. All of those are subjects we might touch on over the next in the next hour. But let me start, Lindiwe, let me start by inviting your reflections. Cyril Ramaphosa on Sunday, when he commented and received the results of the election, made a point of talking about his view that this election showed the strength of democracy in South Africa. So I'm curious, as you look at this election, does this election, in your view, leave South Africa as democracy stronger, weaker? How do you see the effect on South African democracy of the election we've just been through?
Thank you so much, Chris.
You're stunned. Lindiwe, you're on mute. Thank you.
Oh, I'm definitely not on mute. Can you hear me now? Oh, fantastic. Okay. Thank you so much, Chris.
We still have you on mute. I don't know how that's happened. Maybe we've put you on mute. There we go. I think.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Excellent.
Fantastic. No, I was saying thank you so much for the question and for having me tonight. The short answer is it's left us stronger. I have no doubts about that. It was a shock to the system, and there will be temporary growing pains. We're going to tear new muscles, I think, over the next few weeks and then few months, and possibly over the course of the 5-year term, however the coalition arrangements turn out. But in the long run, this is something that the South African democratic project has always hinged on. Can we have a peaceful change of government? Will the governing party accept that change of government? And in doing so, what kind of arrangements will it embark on in order to govern the country? And all indications are, as you point out from what President Ramaphosa said at the IEC, are that the ANC is unflinchingly accepting the results. There's absolutely no questioning of the IEC's integrity, of the freedom and fairness of the election. And so although we're feeling deep levels of uncertainty, we're also peeling away some kind of old conventions that sort of existed in South African politics. The first one I noticed was how you described the results. In the past, when we talked about results in South Africa, we would say the ANC won 52% or 57% or 70% or whatever. We never spoke about it in terms of seats. We now have to think in terms of parliamentary seats, which means the focus of South African politics shifts from what's happening at headquarters at Luthuli House in Johannesburg to what's happening on the floor of the National Assembly. Everything kind of gets broken open into a far more public debate, even once the coalition negotiations are done behind closed doors. Debates about the budget, about legislation. It's really going to uncover how much of our democracy depends on solid parliamentary processes, great leadership in that institution. And I think overall it's going to strengthen the institution in the long run.
Do you worry? Do you worry about the drop in turnout, about the difficulty of even conducting the election with even a record low turnout, taking hours and hours for people to be able to vote at all? Are those signs of a weakening democracy?
No, they're signs of a cynical parliament. So we're going into our seventh parliament. The sixth parliament was given a constitutional court judgment in June of 2020. They needed to make way for independent candidates. They cooled their jets, didn't draft anything for 2 years, asked constitutional court for 2 deadlines, and at the 11th hour produced a clumsy piece of legislation to amend the Electoral Act that did the barest minimum to comply, malicious compliance with the legislation. I suspect because parties thought it's in their interest to prevent independents from coming into the system. At the same time, they made more stringent the requirements for voting. You couldn't vote outside your own voting station, even if you were in your own province. You couldn't vote on the national ballot if you weren't in your province. These are all things we could do in 2019. In 2019, 1.6 million people voted only on the national ballot, which means they were outside their province. Only 300,000 of those people were able to vote in this election. So when you ask why did we have long queues, it's because the system was rejigged and rigged in order to limit entry for new players by some quite cynical political parties. But the consequence of that is that people were queuing for too long. There were too many ballots. The middle ballot was too long. The process was confusing. The IEC was no longer allowed to use teaching staff to administer the election because there were questions about politicization from other political parties. Treasury didn't give them enough budget. Parliament didn't give them enough time. There were a matter of weeks between the finalization of the Amendment Act, which went through some Concord challenges, and the actual vote taking place. And it was just quite mad of Parliament to think that it could play fast and loose with this. So there's some really important lessons to be learned. But my sense, even the IEC's sense, is that voter turnout would have far exceeded the 17 million of the last election had the legislation not been maliciously drafted, had the institution been properly funded, and had it had the resources to do a proper public communications campaign, inform people, and empower them to be able to make voting decisions.
That's great. Well, listen, you mentioned the independent candidates who were able to run this time for the first time. I want to come back to that in a little bit. But let me go to Sherylle. Let me ask you, same question. As you look at this election, and you, I know, were working with the media monitoring group and coalition of some of civil society in South Africa, looking at questions of disinformation, how the run up to the election was being seen by citizens across the country. When you look at this and this experience, do you see this election leaving South African democracy stronger or weaker?
Thanks, Chris. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, yep.
Okay.
And Fred, if you could just turn up the volume a little bit, that would be great in the room. Thank you.
I think that, first, I just want to agree with the last point that Lindiwe made around voter turnout. And so, part of my answer to your question about whether our democracy is stronger or weaker slightly deviates from what Lindiwe has just said. I think our democracy is neither stronger nor weaker, and I'm going to tell you why. First of all, the ability of citizens to exercise their rights to vote freely, safely, and without undue manipulation, I think is a critical element of a strong democracy. Did we achieve that? I think we partially achieved that. It was generally a free and fair election with not as significant incidences of violence. So we will take that as a victory. In terms of voter turnout, you rightly pointed, there was a decline or the downward trend from the 2019 general election from 66% to 58.61%. So while this election was being touted as the most significant election since 1994, I think voter apathy is indicative of the general dissatisfaction of South Africans who seem to have lost faith and trust in democracy and the constitutional promises that have been made over the past 30 years. With the rising levels of unemployment, failing infrastructure, corruption, and the growing inequalities, I think this is an understandable consequence of a low voter turnout and the declining support for the African National Congress. But those who did turn out to vote also expressed their dissatisfaction in the choices they made. Everyone predicted that the ANC would lose their majority, but no one predicted the extent of their decline. The DA, the largest opposition party, I think, in my opinion, did not gain any momentum and remains relatively in the same position. So citizens being able to express their dissatisfaction in the choices that they've made through their votes, I think is what democracy in action feels like and looks like. So these outcomes means our democracy is still strong. I say strong, but not stronger, because of the meteoric rise in support of the newly formed parties like the MK Party, which has emerged as the third largest party. And it's concerning, particularly because they ran a very divisive tribal nationalistic campaign modeled on populist and authoritarian campaigns similar to those of the Trump and Modi and others that ran on these similar types of narratives. And then the other aspects, and this is something that we've picked up, as you've mentioned, through our work with Media Monitoring Group and monitoring disinformation, and particularly online disinformation, is the rising anti-rights movements, predominantly fueled by online disinformation campaigns. I started by saying a successful election is premised on voters being able to vote free from manipulation. And I don't think that this election was free from manipulation. To the extent that disinformation campaigns by parties such as the MK Party and others like the smaller parties that gained a lot of votes this time, like the Patriotic Alliance, have played a significant role in spreading false narratives, undermining institutions such as our Electoral Commission, undermining our Constitution and the rule of law. So we are a strong democracy, but we could be stronger, but for the harmful narratives, online and offline disinformation, and a rising anti-rights movement legitimized through political parties that has to some extent weakened our democracy. I think that's basically what my feelings are around this election.
And could I just press you a little bit on that? So the campaign affected that is one perspective. One of our guests online has been pointing out that the people who didn't vote felt that the election wasn't going to affect their material interest one way or the other, and that it wasn't about the campaign, it was about the experience of the last 5, 6 or longer years that was actually leading to a disillusionment with democratic participation. Do you think that was also a factor here, or do you really think it was the campaign itself that was creating that effect?
I think it's both, because, to some extent, yes, it is the disillusionment. And that's why I said that, a lot of people didn't turn up to vote because, what was the point? But the campaigning and and this it just didn't happen in the past 8 months. The foundations have been set through divisive campaigning, riling up, very emotive sentiments around the public. And look, the type of, for example, the MK party, who was really just newly established in December, the fact that they've gained popularity, the one is that obviously, Jacob Zuma is a very popular leader, and he's very well liked, particularly within KwaZulu-Natal. He's a charismatic leader, but the groundwork was set long before around him undermining or his supporters undermining the Electoral Commission. Particularly, a lot of the disinformation was around individual IEC commissioners themselves and their affiliations with President Cyril Ramaphosa, as well as the fact that they've many allegations through online campaigns around the IEC stuffing ballots, and they're going to rig the elections. So they've set this foundation to tarnish the credibility of the IEC. That's the one aspect. And the second aspect was really around this victimization narrative. And I think, again, it's been played out by populist leaders around the globe around him being victimized, being persecuted by the establishment, the constitutional court, the constitution itself, as well as the generally the democratic dispensation that we are in. So it was really anti-establishment, and really about victimization and how he played on the emotions of people, that he was really a martyr that was trying to, he's a freedom fighter that was really trying to liberate South Africa from this second evil that we call democracy and our constitution.
Well, we'll come back to him and the Constitution in a moment. Jonny, let me come to you. Same question. When you look at this, do you see this election and this run-up to the election as leaving South African democracy stronger or weaker?
Well, Chris, I think it's too early to say, because part of the answer is how South Africa deals with an era of coalition politics, and that hasn't begun yet. And it's a crucial part of the question. So the next 5 years is a time to answer that question, but also what happens 12 days from now. And the ANC is facing the most monumental choice. At the moment, it looks like MK have ruled themselves out of a position in national government. And so one possibility is an ANC-EFF coalition with a couple of minnows to make up 50. And if that happens, literally hours after that happens, there's going to be chaos in the bond and currency markets. The country's going to be hit very, very hard for making that choice. And the beginning of that government will be a very, very hard, unstable, and difficult one. It will be a very volatile time. And the ANC, the NEC of the ANC, which is probably going to make a big decision later this week, is acutely aware of that. And I think that if they do decide to go with the DA and the IFP probably in a confidence and supply rather than a coalition. A lot of people in the ANC will feel that they have been blackmailed into that decision by insidious financial institutions, foreign governments. I mean, that discourse is very prevalent in the ANC. And many in the ANC regard the DA as the local chapter of a global foe. And essentially will feel that they've been blackmailed into going into alliance with their foe. And that the choice that they will have made will be a constraint on their sovereignty imposed by outside actors. I think that it won't be an overwhelming consensus in the ANC. That's what happened, but it'll be a very, very strong line of thought in the ANC. And if the ANC does go into a relationship with the DA thinking that, it's an unstable time. Cyril Ramaphosa has 3 years to go as the president of the organization. He does not have a chosen successor. So the ANC will be in a cooperative relationship with the party it feels at very best ambivalent about, with a leadership tussle going on. The leadership tussle itself is going to be a referendum inside the ANC on whether it's made the right decision. And so whatever happens, I think the next 5 years are going to be a tricky time. And it is about one term. It isn't about the democracy itself, obviously. But those questions do begin to run into each other when things get very heated. And I mean, I really don't want to be too pessimistic because, the ANC dropped to 40%, and on Sunday, its response was not just good, it was unbelievably gracious. You had a president and a secretary general who were humorous, who were impeccably gracious, and that's a very good start. I do think over the long term, South Africa has an electoral system which makes holding a consensus about basic values over a generation or two quite hard. Because South Africa obviously is one of the most unequal countries in the world, which makes holding a consensus over basic values very hard, because when there's that much inequality, few people have the authority to say what basic values are. And secondly, since the 1970s, it's an economy which has been very, very vulnerable to global cycles. And so the citizens of the country get hit very hard from time to time, as they have over the last 13, 14 years, which also makes consensus hard. And we have an electoral system which does not encourage mainstream parties who agglomerate broad interests easy. We have a low threshold PR system, which means that parties in the extremes keep popping up from the side. Latest is MK, but there are going to be many more in the future. So I think it's much too early to answer your question. And there isn't going to be a simple answer for a long time.
So let me ask all of you, start with you, and then I'd be curious, both Lindiwe and Sherylle, what you think of this. I mean, I was struck when President Ramaphosa was speaking on Sunday, and then again in his newsletter that he published on Monday, the number of references to the Constitution, to constitutional order, to the rule of law, it's over and over and over again. And in some ways, that's a not very indirect reference to MK's platform of calling for the repeal of the '96 Constitution and the institution of a system very familiar to us here in the UK of parliamentary sovereignty and the inability of a constitutional court to overturn the decisions of a sovereign parliament. Is the big shift in the electoral results seem not to be very big for anybody except the MK and the ANC. Everybody else is moving around a little bit. There are a few small parties that came in the first time. But basically, it looks like a fairly substantial sudden support for this party that was running against the '96 Constitution. Is that a sign of a different kind of weakness in the country? That is, I mean, there's a lot of talk about the possibility of this being a stronger moment for democracy, and maybe if you can survive the coalition politics. But even if a coalition of the kind you describe succeeds in any kind of centrist way, it could simply accelerate the movement of those voters that did vote for the ANC or for the DA into more extreme parties. Is even a coalition could just continue to drive the movement at the extremes. Is that what we're looking forward to?
I mean, on the one hand, in a country like South Africa, you have 70% of people who cast their votes voting for the center right or the center left, which in the South African situation is extraordinary. I mean, you certainly don't get that in the US. And South Africa, like the US, has experienced more than half a generation of economic decline. And yet still 70% of people are voting for the center, which is extraordinary if you think about it. But just I mean, if you have dinner at an ordinary working class table in a township in South Africa, opinions on basic values are all over the place. There isn't really an anchor.
Yeah.
And the anchor has to come from the political system. It can't come from some innate set of values in the population.
Mm-hmm.
And my concern is that we don't have an electoral system which holds centrist values together. Mm-hmm. And so the prospect that you're talking about, I think, is agitated by the electoral system, of the center coming together and an invitation from the electoral system to set up something on the extremes to contest it.
Sherylle, come back to you. I mean, do you see in all this the invocation of the Constitution and rule of law on one hand, and the explicit running on a platform of the remarkable popular support, at least at the 6 months after the founding of a party, for the repeal of the Constitution? Do you see this as a movement that we're going to see more and more of the country turning away from the Constitution and giving up on the particular constitutional dispensation that was constructed in '96?
So at the moment, Chris, I'm still torn between defining MK as a new party and defining it as the hijacking of a particular part of the ANC for a particular charismatic populist leader's own personal revenge. This is as much an ANC phenomenon as anything else. And I'm not 100% convinced that that sharp turn necessarily represents sentiment throughout the country. And of course, if you pull together the results of the MK and the ANC, you have a fairly reasonable approximation of what a steady decline for the party would have looked like, right? Just over 50%. So I think it's really important for us to make that distinction, but no less dangerous. Because if there is a contestation over constitutional values that was able to create a hijacking and a breakaway inside the ANC, it means elements of that anti-constitutional sentiment still reside in the party. And the guys out front are doing everything that they can to hold those values together. But it seems to me to be more of an organizational challenge that affects us because that organization has the largest majority, that it is necessarily a societal challenge for us as South Africans. So I'm not yet sure how to sort of grapple with that without being in denial. But we do have to recognize how much of MK and EFF and COPE and all these other breakaways, many of them were about interpersonal animus and rivalry and revenge between individual leaders inside a political party. If you listen to the voice notes coming out of KwaZulu-Natal, you will hear the heads of wards and constituencies bitterly complaining about the fact that they gave food parcels to the door-to-door with and engaged with old ladies in their ward. And meanwhile, those old ladies were wearing ANC colors, but planning the whole time to go and vote for the MK. So it's like an internal putsch inside the party. Let me not dwell on that for too long. All of that is to say, is you're absolutely right. I agree with Jonny on the sort of the danger of not having a consensus in South Africa about what our values are. We have that consensus. It was crafted in our constitution, which is a document born out of a parliamentary election, which was written by MPs in the first parliament. But that value set hasn't translated. Otherwise, it wouldn't be so easy for the MK to advance narratives about how we need to get rid of this constitution. We don't need it. People don't really live and breathe or experience the constitution on a daily basis. So they're not 100% clear on what it is they're in danger of losing. So that's what I'm afraid of. The second thing I'm afraid of, if you cast your mind back to the riots in July of 2021, a lot of what happened there was a consequence of Zuma's faction of the ANC back when he was still in the party. And I caution everyone to remember that he is still a member of the ANC. He has a disciplinary committee meeting coming up inside the ANC, which he has indicated he will participate in and go and defend himself. But during that July riot, one of the reasons it was unpredictable, unforeseeable, was in fact because his faction of the party had captured much of the security apparatus, a thing that President Zuma did even back in the days when I was in parliament, just quietly amassing power in institutions that are supposed to be independent, from intelligence to police to the NPA and others. President Ramaphosa has been able to claw back some of those institutions, certainly the leadership of the NPA, for example, if not necessarily the whole institution, which is still fighting to make a comeback. But the intelligence services are in complete disarray and largely cannibalized by Zuma's faction. The police have been largely cannibalized by Zuma faction. In the run-up to the election, there were questions about whether police officers and stations needed to get rid of their armories because whoever was in the station may or may not start an insurrection on behalf of MK. So that to me is a very present danger. And I don't know whether a coalition government of the ANC and the DA, this obsession with markets, with currency, it belies the real danger for us, which is a security risk that we're not talking enough about. And we miss the opportunity to talk about what it looks like to bring back those institutions into the center, into independence, and to undo this kind of grip that the Zuma faction of what was the ANC and is now MK has on these institutions. And you can bet your life that they are perfectly capable of wreaking the kind of havoc that will change South Africa for the worse.
Right. Sherylle, let me come to you. And also that, I mean, you've dedicated your life and career for the rule of law and the rights in the Constitution. So I'm curious how you see this, whether there's a growing danger of a further abandonment of those commitments in the country. But maybe you could also comment, we had a question from one of our audience members online about how you counter this, not just with the MK, but with the youth, with the new generation of South Africans. Is there a way? Well, how do you see this trend of the Constitution? And is there a way to reinforce the commitment that you have in this new generation of South African youth?
Yeah, I think, as a human rights lawyer, I find those statements a personal attack on me. But it also demonstrates, in part, our failures of being vigorous, about being energetic around, bringing ordinary South Africans into the space that we are, where we value the Constitution, we value the rule of law, we value the historical, journey that the Constitution has brought us in. A lot of people have not, as Lindiwe said, seen the benefits of the Constitution. And it's largely because of the failings of the government over the last 30 years. And also because there hasn't been tangible change. We have this, the Constitution is a very aspirational, transformative document. That's what the drafters of the Constitution and those who were involved in sitting together and building this new constitutional transformational democracy, that was the idea about it. And what sets us apart from everybody else is that we were a new democracy, and that our Constitution had not just given people the right to vote, not just given people the right civil and political rights, but it also promised the delivery of socioeconomic rights. And I think that's where the failings were. So when you talk about the public sentiment and why they're frustrated or why they're dissatisfied, it's because they haven't seen the benefits of the advancements of socioeconomic rights in the country. And I think that for me is why they are so open or so easily manipulated by these types of narratives that, this is not working for you, so let's try something else. And the danger is that, that people would buy into that, and people would see that this is not working out for them and they need a change. And I think that is actually, demonstrable in the way people voted and the way people stayed away.
So So I'm going to open it up and see if there are questions in the room. Just ask if you have a question, just try and keep it succinct so we get lots of people in, and make sure it ends with a question mark. But Lindiwe, I have one online here before we take our first one in the room. One of our audience members points out that you were part of the DA in an earlier phase of your life. When you look at the team that they've assembled, the negotiating team, what do you see what would you hope to see from this team, and what do you expect to see in terms of a strategic approach to these discussions?
Yes, I was a leader in the DA until 2014. And look, I reiterate my earlier concern. I'm worried that both negotiating teams, the veterans of the ANC and the sort of Tony Leon, Helen Zille, Ryan Coetzee, and so forth of the DA, are much too focused on economic stability and not enough interested in security. And so to answer your question, I think those are the things that will concern them. Yes, they will take an interest in sort of constitutional and rule of law issues, absolutely. But I don't necessarily think that what is front of mind is going to be security based. I think it's going to be more about the economy, economic policy, the national health insurance proposal, proposals around employment equity, around Black economic empowerment. I can tell you from experience, those have always been highly contested in the DA, and I personally was on the other side of the current leadership on these issues. So I think that's going to be their focus area. I also think what they're going to be wrestling with that's going to be quite terrifying for them is the reality that any deal they do with the ANC is going to hit them at the ballot. The ANC and the DA are not going to survive spending 30 years telling their voters that this is the worst party ever, and then going into government with that party. People have a tendency to punish. In the UK, you'll know the Lib Dems have suffered this fate. They have a tendency to punish you for actually doing the right thing. And I do think it is the right thing. I think it is the best of the options on the table. But I think the challenge for the guys in the DA is going to be, how do we preserve as much of our identity as we can while contributing to the most stable, least worst option available? I think the ANC is going to make the same calculus. But on both sides, it's very establishment figures, heavily invested in the economic side, but perhaps not as much expertise on the security questions.
Terrific. Questions in the room? Yes, sir.
I've got a question for Mr. Steinberg. He made a statement that, let me put it this way, given the fact that South Africa is such a diverse country, is it not then normal for us to expect that we'll always have these, elements coming into our political system from the fringes that dominate the narrative once in a while? Because we made a statement that our political elites are not building the narrative for the people. But I'm thinking to myself, is the democratic system not designed for the voice to come from the bottom up? And if we're going to allow that, you'll constantly be getting random left field kind of positions because we're such a diverse nation.
Yeah, I do think we need to be governed from the bottom up. And I think that being governed from the bottom up, having a government that really reflects what a majority of people want in a country as complex as South Africa, requires a system where people are motivated to aggregate broad interests. Because the alternative is that you have somebody who manages to galvanize 5% of the vote or 7% of the vote, and there are 3 or 4 parties who do that, and they add up to 20% of people, but they represent hardly anybody. They represent 5 or 7% of people. They're very extreme, they're very alarming. 95% of people don't believe in them, but they become kingmakers. And I think that you need to avoid a system which does that. It's precisely because South Africa is so diverse that there's such an extraordinary range of opinion and feeling and thoughts that it's absolutely necessary to aggregate so that the majority will can actually be expressed.
Other question?
Jonny, I know this has been a view of yours for some time now on the Westminster first past the post or something like that. as opposed to our extreme proportional representation. But what struck me, when I had you in mind today when I was looking at the South African, the English polls. So the Labour Party is currently polling roundabout where the ANC polls. Conservative Party is polling roundabout where the DA polls. And the EFF is probably polling roundabout where Reform polls. Yet in this country, this will be seen as an overwhelming victory for the Labour Party, a resounding victory. Whereas we talk about the ANC as having lost, as it were, credibility, the liberation movement's fallen apart. So, I mean, the difficulty I see is this, that the ANC is a liberation party which was a very broad church. It is, as you have to happen at some stage, whether it's, like in India or here, at some stage it has to splinter. And it is splintering, and it's splintering along what you might call fairly traditional political lines. There's a sort of a centre-right and a centre-left and a further left. So I have difficulty in seeing how a change of the electoral system would actually improve things. And I'm sceptical that it would pull people into sort of two big parties, which I think is your thesis.
Well, the ANC hasn't lost credibility. It's the biggest party by almost double. And that means that it has to be a major part of government, no matter the electoral system. I mean, if you could conjure an electoral system where a party is double the size of the next biggest and isn't part of government, that would be a really bad system.
But they would be the 100% party in government. They would win every constituency.
No, what I'm saying is that a great danger in a country which struggles to hold on to a set of core values is an electoral system which drives people apart and which offers an open invitation to very, very extremist parties that will never get more than 5% of the votes to call the shots. I think that in a country as unequal as South Africa, that's over the long term, it makes it very hard for that country to stay together. And that's my main concern about the electoral system.
Right.
And Chris,
please go ahead, jump in.
I always find debates about electoral systems to be frustrating because we're always looking for a silver bullet. But actually, every country needs a different system at a different time. Britain needs more PR right now. South Africa needs more districts. And the solution that a lot of people have coalesced around, even Minister Aaron Motsoaledi's Commission on Electoral Reform initially coalesced around, was that we should have a mixed PR and constituency-based system. And again, for those of you who live in the UK, certainly for me, when I was living in the UK, what that does is force choices. It forces pragmatism. Is this a winnable ward for the party you want to support? If not, what's your second choice? And that has the effect of doing what Jonny suggests, which is forcing people to think beyond the narrow confines of their, color, beret, jersey, loyalty, and to start to think about what other options look like and what other options align to a common set of values that the whole society has. But of course, we know that constituency systems can produce governments of like a 35% party getting 50% plus one of the seats. So that's underrepresentative as well. But I do think when we think about electoral system failure, we have to think about the moment in which it is failing and what is the best solution for the short to medium and hopefully to the long term. And when it stops working, to rethink it. So sometimes that means two different countries literally moving in opposite directions. But where Britain needs more PR, South Africa does, it needs more constituency-based representation. And that's one of the things that was so cynical about the way in which Parliament drafted the Electoral Amendment Act, just to throw independent candidates on party lists. The upshot of that process was meant to be the districting of South Africa. And that's not what happened at all.
But can I Lindiwe, stay with that? Maybe I'd ask each of you this question. I mean, South Africa, the democracy that was born in 1994 and that we saw play out in the early years of the democratic dispensation was not just it wasn't just a playbook from another country. It was an experiment, a creative experiment of trying to build a new kind of democracy, trying to make an innovation for the whole world that was meant to sort of point to a way democracy could work. And that spirit of experimentation and being a kind of model, in some ways, Lindiwe, you in particular, and your support and advocacy for the ability of independent candidates to run, the change of the party grip on on South African elections. I'm just guessing, I don't know this, but I'm imagining you must be disappointed in the way that the independent candidates were both how it was structured that they would come out, but then also what the results were. Have we seen is in some ways what you're debating here is there a continued appetite for democratic experimentation, electoral reform? Are there changes, as one of our questioners online says, are there further changes you want to see to the Electoral Act? Should we hold on to this idea of being an active and creative experiment in democratic construction, or do we need to pull in the lines and go to something more familiar or more established? What do you think?
So I don't advocate experimentation with democracy. What I do advocate is not repeating something that isn't working just because it's the way things are. The status quo doesn't make it right just because it's the status quo. And I think a lot of people have forgotten that the PR system was suitable for the era in which the PR system was designed, but there was always an understanding that over time we would transition into some kind of mixed system. Frederick van Zyl-Slabbert tabled recommendations. Kgalema Motlanthe, the former president, has tabled recommendations. Numerous civil society have tabled recommendations. All of them preserve the constitutional requirement for proportionality by keeping either 50% or more of the ballot PR and simultaneously give voters a chance to have a representative in a district that they can identify and point to as the person who represents them through constituency-based elections. That's an evolution that's overdue. Both reports, one was in the early 2000s, one was in the 2010s. They are long overdue. So it's not a question of experimentation, it's actually a question of delayed change. And I really can't emphasize enough how cynical it was of Parliament to design the system for independence the way it did. The Constitution was clear that you don't have to be a part of a political party in order to run for election and, if elected, to serve. But the effect, the consequence of this Electoral Amendment Act is that you have to run with a political party. A lot of great potential independent candidates took one look at that law. They took a look at the petition thresholds. They took a look at the seat threshold. The difference in Gauteng between a seat threshold for a regional seat and a national seat is 30,000 versus 130,000. And independents can only appear on the regional seat. So it was completely rigged to keep them out of the system. So I don't count the Electoral Amendment Act as a thing that introduced independence. Parliament has to go back to the drawing board and do the work. And I reiterate, President Motlanthe, Minister Motsoaledi, the majority of the commission that he assembled all made recommendations that South Africa needs to be districted. We have it at local election level, it works. We have a combination of PR and ward councillors. PR councillors end up in government, ward councillors represent their constituents. We can do it at national level, but it was cynicism and a cynical desire to arrest change that brought about this dreadful law. And it's, I think, the parties have been like hoisted by their own petard in this room.
Just, we've got about 10 minutes before we're going to draw this to a close, but let me, Sherylle and Jonny, let me get your take on this. I mean, is there a change you'd like to see now taken up about the Electoral Act, or do we need a break from electoral creativity?
No, look, I think from my point of view, I agree with Lindiwe. I think that this Electoral Amendment Act was rushed through. I don't think this was the opportunity for independent candidates to truly benefit from it, even in its current form. And that's, you've seen it with the results, that they haven't done a lot, but this is a step forward, I think, for that type of dual system to work in tandem. And so I really think that this was not the opportunity for them, but possibly the next two elections will see better representation from a constituent level. And so that's what I would like to see. I would like to see that they're being given an equal and a fair shot, to run for government.
Jonny?
I'm not going to be very long. I mean, I agree. I think the discussion should be had from the beginning rather than ended. Excellent.
Other comments, questions in the room? Yes, sir. Right in the back, and they'll come over here. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. I think this one's for Jonny and Indy around the what I dubbed the Zulu vote. I appreciate that Lindiwe says the MK is effectively a faction of the ANC. That's true, but I think my concern is, to what extent is this a point of no return when it comes to tribal politics? Are we not seeing echoes of, say, pre-1994 violence, with the IFP and everybody else? What does this look like with respect to, sorry, for lack of a better word, the Zulu vote?
I think that's an excellent and very difficult question, because if you trace over a map of South Africa where MK did well, and look at a map of deep conflict over the last 50 years, they trace over each other exactly. So we're not just talking about Jacob Zuma, and we're not just talking about a fight inside the ANC. We are talking about very deep social dynamics which go back to deep into the apartheid era. And so to imagine that, Jacob Zuma getting old and retiring would end this dynamic, I think is foolish, that it's much more complex than that. I mean, having said that, I don't think that there's some essential, exceptional Zulu identity going through time, which and that Zuma is simply the latest manifestation of it. I think that, if there is an ANC minority government with a conference and supply arrangement with the IFP and the DA, those groups have to think incredibly carefully about KZN and the Mpumalanga and Gauteng and what they're going to do to those 2 million plus people who voted for MK. And how they're going to be invited back in. As things stand, they voted for a party that wants to abolish the constitution. What do you say to them? How do you convince them to come back in? I think it's an incredibly delicate task and requires some nuanced, high-level thinking by all three of those parties together. It's a huge challenge.
Perfect. Sir, you want to come?
Right, a slightly different sort of question. Looking at the bigger picture, because obviously it seems to me from listening from a relatively ignorant position, but there's fundamental conflicts between the inequality, diversity, and having a constitution, which you've been talking about. And I just wondered if there's any value in comparing, contrasting to the US, which also has diversity, huge inequality, but has sort of, until relatively recently, kept the Constitution as something that is populist, defend the Constitution, the American dream, and these sorts of things. Now, obviously, it's got a few hundred years behind it to get there, but is this an early, is it just because it's early and hasn't been able to get that populist support, or can you never get populist support because you've got this huge inequality? I mean, I don't know, looking at the sort of bigger picture.
Any thoughts on the possibility of harmonizing, or where we're going in populism, constitutional support? Lindiwe, you're shaking your head. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question Jonny might be asking is like, can you change people's minds when he talks about this sort of long, deep history of ethnic and tribal mobilization of AmaZulu in South Africa for nefarious ends, which has been done by the National Party, the ANC, the IFP, now MK. And I think it's similar to this question as well. Are we the kind of democracy that tries to change people's minds, or are we a democracy where people just turn out their base? And so all it is a collection of bases. In the run-up to this election, and certainly in the politics that I was a part of, the great social challenge was to transform South Africa's politics into something less about who you are and more about what you believe in, while recognizing that who you are has a massive influence on what you believe, and who you are in South Africa is largely determined by your identity. So not being denialist about the realities of identity's impact on people's lives, but thinking, what does a society look like where an election is like, I like this party, but this party could work. At the moment, it's actually not many people who think that way about elections. It's very much a sort of a group of fixed voters who political parties just compete to turn out. And the NC lost the turnout wars in this election. Its votes were turned out by the MK and not by itself. So yeah, to answer your question, I think that building a polity or a politics where people can move allegiances depends on all the stuff we were talking about earlier. Can we find common values? Can we agree on what our society should look like? Can we agree about what's fair and just and what isn't? Can we agree about the past and the future to a certain extent? And then debate who gets to solve these problems most effectively, rather than saying it's like an ethnic census or it's a racial census, it's colored nationalism, it's white nationalism, it's, you know, Zulu nationalism. Because the other thing I'll say for my people, and I'm Zulu as well, is that Zulus are not the only nationalists in South Africa. They're not the only identity voters in South Africa. They're the only ones who get singled out, right? White South Africans are identity voters. Tulsa South Africans are identity voters, but they never get singled out in the same way. And it's probably because there's a history of violence associated with Zulu nationalism to a certain extent. But that violence, again, is not the preserve of any party. The National Party stoked it. The ANC, to a less extent, the IFP absolutely stoked it. And now MK is taking its turn.
Sherylle, let me ask you, any thoughts on this or anything else in closing? Any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with Lindiwe, but about identity politics, it's within our, you know, it's ingrained within our history and our culture, and I think that's always going to be a factor. I think one of the people in the audience were talking about, you know, comparatively, you know, the U.S. Constitution and the South African Constitution, and I just want to say that you have to look at the date and the time that those constitutions were signed into law, and that's where the major difference comes in between U.S. politics and South African politics, because our constitution was created, you know, on the foundation or the liberation of people that were historically persecuted on the basis of their race, their religion, their nationality, and their social identity. And I think that in itself makes this constitution more workable in terms of setting the tone of our values. And that's what we were. We never sat down, I think, and worked out, as a lot of people have spoken about, you know, what is South Africa's identity, South Africans' identity, what is our value system. And I think that when we drafted the constitution, that was sort of leading towards developing those types of values based on equality, non-discrimination, and respect for everybody despite their ethnic or tribal allegiances. And I think for me, that is what sort of stands us apart from the rest of democracies across the globe.
Jonny, any final thoughts on this or other subjects?
I think I'm sated. I think we're all anxiously looking at the next 12 days. They're going to, this is the first big moments of many to come.
Well, listen, thank you all. I want a personal comment on as Sherylle said, the contrast with American constitutionalism. I mean, it's not just the last recent period when Americans have been tearing up their constitution. The Civil War was a rather big version of that. And as the American sociologist David Reisman used to say, the puzzle is not to try and explain the causes of that Civil War, but to understand why Americans aren't at civil war constantly. And I think you could ask the same. All these societies are always in danger of pulling themselves apart. And the more ambitious the democratic experiment, in some ways, the more fragile that unity and that holding together. The American Constitution, of course, was most notorious in those early years for the conflicts it didn't resolve, for slavery, for electoral dispensation, for electoral franchise, and it took decades to work those out, and we're still struggling over those in the United States. I think the challenge, somehow in a moment like this, is to keep the dynamism in that process going, to keep what holds the country together in view, but never be complacent about that, because it is a constant project of democracy to keep democracy from tearing itself apart. Thanks to all of you. Lindiwe, thank you so much. Sherylle, thank you. Jonny, thank you very much. Thanks to all of you, particularly those who added in your own comments and questions, those of you online who shared your questions. And with that, we'll all be watching for the next 12 days and probably for the next 12 months and maybe the next 12 years to see how this election plays out. Thank you very, very much, and we are adjourned.